Hi, this is Josh Beiser from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Game Industry Insight, a look behind the scenes at game development. And be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future video topics. For today's Industry Insight, we're going to be talking about the dangers of going big, or when a developer will kind of try to reach for the moon and the stars and it ends up crashing and burning. And why there's always that allure of always wanting to go higher and higher, even in cases where the studio or the people involved just aren't up to the task. And understanding why there is that danger of taking things too far, I have turned my fan up to its fullest speed. Normally I keep things low so that you don't hear it, but I figured this will be a great analogy for the dangers of why you always have to temper what you're trying to aim for. And now I'm going to shut things off so that it doesn't sound like I'm in a wind turbine, and we'll be starting up our topic right now. Alright, with the fan shut off and I'm going to start sweating in a few minutes, let's get to today's topic. Like I said, when it comes to going big, this is the trend of a developer trying to essentially win the lottery or hit a home run. And what's very interesting is this is something that we see predominantly in the independent space. And I think there are several reasons and theories why. Now, as we've talked about before, one of the major challenges of being an independent developer is getting notoriety. It's about building yourself and your game company as a brand. And for a lot of smaller developers, they want to, of course, keep growing. I mean, no one wants to get stuck in one place or one part of their business. So there's always that challenge or that interest in saying, well, if people like this, let me try something even bigger and see if we can, strike gold or hit while the iron is hot or stuff like that. And when it comes to independent developers, we see this especially when a developer gets their first big hit. And I may be pissing off a few people with this next sentence, but this is why whenever I hear about a big name, your Five Nights at Freddy's, your Minecraft, Stardew Valleys, and so on, the first big success of a studio is not where I keep my interests. What I want to pay attention to is what comes next from that studio, because this is the defining point as to whether or not a company can keep going, and why this ever-present allure of going big comes into play. Like I said, while no one wants to be stuck in the same position, no one wants to be considered one note. That you are only going to be defined by one video game in your entire career in the game industry, and that's it. And this is where going big comes into play. Because if everyone liked my first game, well then surely I need to go even beyond that for my second game. And when we talk about going big, this is typically going to be the second game from a major studio, or from an independent studio, or the first game after their big rise to fame. And sadly, we have a few examples to talk about in this, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But what makes going big so dangerous is that it's very much a case of you trying to double down. And sometimes, you are going beyond what even your own skills are. And when you're trying to design a game like this, like we've said, when it comes to game development, there is no checklist or goalposts for a video game. You can make whatever you want with whatever design you want, and you can spend however long you want, of course, as long as you have money. Sorry, my allergies are starting to flare up here, so I may be coughing a little bit more. As you go through game development. Unfortunately, without having... I think we're going to take a quick break while I do some coughing. I'll be right back. Oh, I am really sorry about that, folks. One day I decided to change the fan speed and all that, and now I'm having multiple takes in this video. But, as I was saying, when it comes to having a set definition for your video game, because you are free to do whatever you want, it makes it very important to understand project and team management. And we've talked about this many times before, especially with indie developers on the live and recorded casts. If you can't manage a group of people or keep a project on task, your game is doomed to fail. And this becomes compounded if you're deciding to do something that is beyond what you've ever done before. And this goes back to what I just said regarding no game having a set definition. Just because you've made the best damn 2D platformer in the world doesn't mean that you are going to be able to then translate those skills to making a first-person shooter, or an open-world survival game, or insert any genre here. The beauty and nightmare of game development is that every game is different, which also means that every development is different. This is why for a lot of smaller companies and even the major studios, once they've hit on a proven or successful formula, they will prefer to iterate and refine instead of trying to, again, go out and find the secret sauce a second or third time. Because some cases you may not be able to do that. And if you experiment too far, as we've said, you can easily bankrupt a studio if you decide to go completely unproven or untested. Now, when it comes to trying to define a game or a studio like this, really sorry about that, folks. This is, again, why going big is such a very dangerous detail for a lot of independent studios. Like I just said, just because you've done one game or one genre doesn't translate into a second one. And I have a few good examples that I hate to bring up because I like both companies, but unfortunately this is one of those cases where we have to talk about them. So the first one, of course, is Ark Games. Now, for those of you who are longtime fans, you know I've spoken to Chris Park several times in the past. And their big claim to fame was, of course, AI Wars, which they just did a successful Kickstarter for number 2 earlier in 2017 at this point. But after the success of AI Wars, Chris and the rest of the team there experimented with a lot of unique concepts. They did Daedalus, A Valley Without Wind, Skyward Collapse, The Last Federation, as well as other games that may not have even gone past the prototype stage, such as In Case of Emergency, Send Raptor. And the problem is, none of these games managed to get close to AI Wars. Most importantly was A Valley Without Wind. When I spoke with Chris about this, it seems like a forever ago, he said they basically went all in with this concept. It was their most budgeted title. They spent the most time with that game, and it just sunk. And Chris has said this many times in post-mortems and on posts on on Ark Games' site, that if AI Wars wasn't as big of a success as it was, Ark will have gone under many times before. And the failure of A Valley Without Wind led to them changing their development strategy. Instead of trying to go all in with major ideas, they instead tried to streamline and condense their games into small but very polished and refined gameplay loops to test the waters on the concept. So that if a game does well, they can continue with all these ideas they've kept. If it doesn't do well, then they didn't spend a whole lot on it. But the point is, even though AI Wars was such a driving success, that doesn't automatically mean your second, third, and fourth games are going to be as successful. And again, the risks of if you're trying to put everything into another title. And speaking of which, that takes me to the other example, and one I'm sure for those of you watching, you know who we're about to talk about. And that is Clockwork Empires and Gaslamp Games. Again, I don't want to speak ill of them because I love their games and I think they did an admirable job, but unfortunately this is a perfect example of the risks of going big. Gaslamp Games' first game was, of course, Dungeons of Dreadmore, which is an isometric style roguelike that did really well, I think, for them. And then, of course, when they were trying to decide on their second game, there was a split between the studio. Some of them wanted to make a second Dungeons of Dreadmore or another roguelike, but ultimately it was decided to, again, go big with a 3D Dwarf Fortress-esque city builder which none of them have ever worked on before or had no experience developing a brand new 3D engine on. And you can guess what happened there. And if you didn't, you can be spoiled by my dissecting design. That despite having the experience from Dungeons of Dreadmore, none of that applied to making a brand new design with a brand new engine. And ultimately, the design just ran away from them. And they were never able to get to a point of stability, and it cost them the entire studio. And that is the big danger of when it comes to going big. Because for a lot of smaller studios, you are basically working game to game. Now, of course, if you strike it big with something like Minecraft or Five Nights at Freddy's, that may not be the case. But for a lot of independent studios, you have to always temper your enthusiasm with what you're able to make. If you've been making 2D platformers for the last 3 years, switching to a full 3D survival horror game may not be the best move. But the crux of this, or the other side, is that we have seen developers who have made this work. Clay Entertainment being a really good example. The studio has definitely made a brand for themselves with making very quality and stylized games. And the beauty of it is that each game has belonged to a completely different genre. From open world survival in Don't Starve, turn-based stealth in Invisible Ink, the Dwarf Fortress style with Oxygen Not Included, and they're even working on a fourth game right now, which I think is going to be an RPG. And again, when you look at something like Clay, who have done completely different games with each one of their developments, it's hard not to see that and go, well, if they can do it, why can't I? But again, you always have to understand what your own limitations are. Another big lesson that I want to talk about, at least very briefly, is something that I'm sure all of you are aware of. Throwing money at a game doesn't automatically make it better. And as we've seen many times in the past, development and project management failures can easily sink a game and a company, regardless of the talent and money involved. And I think we may have to do a critical thought or industry insight later on, focusing specifically on why limitations are a benefit for some studios. But to quickly sum it up, being able to work around your limitations can lead to interesting solutions, and in some cases, breakthroughs you never thought possible. With Battle Brawlers, when I spoke with Jan from Overhyped Studios, he talked about how the decision to make all the characters like these little still figurines was simply due to the fact that they didn't have the money or the resources to animate legs, and it turned out to be a very great stylistic choice. But I am sure for all the independent developers watching this that you have your millions of dollars on your private islands to sink on whatever game idea that you want. Please don't take that as me being serious, folks. But the point is, when it comes to working on a project, you always have to understand just what goes into it. And like I just said, having a lot of money doesn't automatically make a game or even guarantee a development. It reminds me of those old shows they used to do in the 90s with when people who had like no money at all came into the lottery, and the first thing they did was just basically buy everything that wasn't nailed down. And this goes back to this risk or this allure of going big after your first big success. If you were able to make this amazing game on a shoestring budget with 5 or 6 people, then imagine what you can do with like $1.5 million, an entire studio behind you. Who cares about running a project? You can just keep throwing money into it. You don't need to worry about delays. But again, this is why ultimately you need to have that strong design and project management sense if you're trying to keep going. And as we've said many times over, there is a big difference between making games at the enthusiast and hobbyist level versus making a studio that can sustain itself. And I've spoken to Chris about this many times in the past, and he's had some really fascinating and somewhat depressing postmortems about the state of Ark over the years, especially when their last game, Stars Beyond Reach, had to be canceled along with In Case of Emergency Release Raptor. And the fact of the matter is, again, just because you've had one success does not make a sustainable studio. Eventually, that money will run out. Whether it runs out in 6 months, 2 years, who knows when the money from Minecraft will run out. But the point is that you always have to understand what your studio is capable of and weigh the risks of continuing what you know versus experimenting with something you don't. And another major lesson before we wrap up again that we've talked about is failing small. If you're going to experiment with something that you've never done before, don't throw $500,000 and 2 years of time into it. And like we've said, it's better to fail at the smallest level with something that you can then learn from and then iterate versus failing on your studio's next major project. And understanding where the fun is and what projects are worthy of continuing developing on, that is a topic that is way too big for this video, and we could probably turn to like a few videos looking at different designs and marketing, and management strategies. But to wrap up today's industry insight, again, when it comes to independent studios, you always have to weigh the risks of continuing to do what you know versus experimenting. And for a lot of developers I've spoken to who have made those massive jumps from one genre or one design to another, they said it was not a walk in the park. Ark Games going from making Ruse to Renowned Explorers, I remember talking to the lead designer. He said that it was a year of hell for the studio with completely doing something brand new. Because again, when you're starting from scratch like that, you are literally starting from scratch. Anything that you've learned or were able to iterate on with your previous game doesn't apply here. And again, for a lot of independent studios, you have to understand that when you're thinking about going big. More importantly, another major point is if you're trying to go big in the same franchise. And that's what the developers of Trine learned the hard way when they decided to kind of soft reboot the series with Trine 3, turning it into a 3D based title with, I think they had like more of a DLC focus. And I think that was another case where the studio nearly went under due to that decision. And again, talking more about branding and how you as a company and your game works as a brand is another major topic. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching today's Industry Insight. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you have a topic for a future vlog, let me know. But otherwise, check back daily for more discussions on game design here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games, and I hope that I won't be coughing as much in our next video. Until then, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBicer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GWBicer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.